David, would you like to introduce yourself and start the meeting, please? Thank you very much.
Good. Okay, well, the first thing to do is to welcome everyone to this JNP webinar, where Tony Greenstein is going to talk about his new book. I need to thank Becky for hosting this, and all I'm going to do now as chair of JNP is to hand over to Haim, who will chair the meeting. And I'm very grateful for him and honoured that Tony Greenstein is with us. So thanks again, everyone, for attending, and I hope you find this an interesting webinar.
Thank you, David, and welcome, everyone. We're very glad and honoured that Tony will introduce his book and launch it through JNP. Tony is, of course, a leading member of JNP, and we're very happy that this very, very important topic will be dealt with on a webinar by JNP. Tony will speak for around 30 to 35 minutes, after which there will be an open Q&A session. And I would like to remind you that in order to be included in the session, you have to raise your hand, your electronic hand, I mean. You obviously know how to do that. And Becky will see you and put you into the queue to ask the questions. Before I introduce Tony, I want to say a couple of words about this topic. There are very few other topics dealing with Zionism that are as misunderstood and unknown as the topic of the Nazi Holocaust and Zionism, and the very complex links between the two. There is a very good reason for that. In order to control the narrative on Zionism, you need to control the narrative on the Holocaust. And one of the ways of controlling it was the setting up of Yad Vashem very early after Israel has declared itself a state. And Israel not only controlled the narrative, but actually presented itself, and still does, as the speaker of the Jewish dead in the Holocaust. Of course, hardly any of those deads, of the 5.5 million Jews that died in the Holocaust, were Zionists. We know that in Eastern Europe, between 1 and 1.5% of the Jewish population were Zionists. So those have left mostly and were already in Palestine. While most of the Jews in Eastern Europe were members of the Bund if they were politically active, or if they were religious, members of religious parties in their locality. So by Israel declaring itself as the representative of the Jewish dead, it actually took the copyright over the Holocaust and its explanations and interpretations. But more importantly, it also made itself the receptor of a lot of money from the new Germany, Western Germany as it was then, through the great system of compensation, not for the victims, because they were dead, but for the Israeli state. So the Israeli state was the main beneficiary of those transfers, huge transfers that are still lasting today. For example, the German arms industry is building all kinds of things for Israel. And this is also financed as part of the same transfer of funds to Israel. So this is not a a historical subject, but it is a subject which is very well alive and is behind the IHRA and this debate about anti-Semitism. And without knowing about the links that Tony is going to speak about, you cannot understand the position of Germany and other countries in Europe properly. So I want to invite Tony, who you all know as probably the foremost activist for Palestine in this country, founder member of the PSC that was forced to leave it because of the current politics, current and in the recent past also. So PSC was set up by people like Tony, and it has changed its politics, which is a sad thing to note today. Tony has published many articles on many topics, but also very important articles in a number of publications on the Holocaust, on Zionism, and on the links between them. Tony, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Haim, for that very kind introduction. I'm not sure I'm the foremost activist in Palestine solidarity, but I'm one amongst many. The question people will ask, I think, is why I am going through this topic, why the Holocaust and Zionism? And my answer to that is really simple. I doubt if there's even a single Palestine solidarity activist in the UK and maybe worldwide who hasn't at one time or another been accused of anti-Semitism. Because of course, if the Palestinians oppose what Israel is doing to them, demolition of villages, homes, and so on, that must be because the people doing it are Jewish, not because of what they're doing. No doubt they would welcome what would happen if they were not Jewish. I mean, that's the absurdity of it. And why is there this horror about anti-Semitism? Why does anti-Semitism resonate in a way that Islamophobia or anti-Black racism doesn't? It's because of the Holocaust. The way the Holocaust has been used and weaponized by the Zionist movement in order to further its project of state building and ethnic cleansing. So I think it's fitting to ask ourselves, what was the Zionist record both before and during the Holocaust? Were they so obsessed with the Holocaust during the Holocaust when it was actually happening? Or as I would argue, that this interest in the Holocaust was only a very late occurrence in the day. It didn't take place till many years after. In fact, the Eichmann trial was when the Zionist movement began to have an interest in the Holocaust, and it formed part of their propaganda. But today, the Holocaust has not just been weaponized by Zionism, it's been weaponized and is part of the ideological armory of imperialism itself, because the imperialist powers, Germany above all, have used the Holocaust as a shield for their own activities. We know that because when Saddam Hussein was demonized, then he was the new Hitler. Gamal Abdel Nasser before him was the new Hitler. So was Yasser Arafat. But Israel in particular, of course, has used the Holocaust mercilessly in pursuit of its objectives. And I think the best description of what Israel has done has come from Professor Edith Zertel, who is a professor of history at Tel Aviv University and a visiting fellow, I think, at Geneva and other universities. So in her book, Politics and Nationhood, she writes, the transference of the Holocaust situation onto the Middle East reality not only created a false sense of the imminent danger of mass destruction, it also immensely distorted the image of the Holocaust, dwarfed the magnitude of the atrocities committed by the Nazis, trivializing the unique agony of the victims and the survivors, and utterly demonizing the Arabs and their leaders, unquote. And then she went on to say, there hasn't been a war involving Israel, quote, that has not been perceived, defined, and conceptualized in terms of the Holocaust, unquote. Israel has mobilized the Holocaust, quote, in the service of Israeli politics, unquote. And you can see this, say, with a fascist Lahava, which goes around beating up Arabs that they think are showing an interest in Jewish women, where it says assimilation is the new Holocaust. So, I mean, that's just one example of how the Holocaust is used. But I say, we know that when Israel went to war with the Arab states, it always invoked the idea that their very survival was at stake, even though that was never the case. So I want to go backwards a little and look at Zionism itself, because one of the things I argue is that the Zionist attitude to the rise of the Nazis, Nazi anti-Semitism, was no different historically from its attitude to anti-Semitism before the Nazis. Their reaction to the Nazis was on a par with their reaction to every other form of anti-Semitism. And we have to really look at where Zionism began, which was in the late 19th century. And I would trace that the pivotal event was the Odessa pogroms in 1881 with the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. And the reaction of the Zionism to anti-Semitism was different from any other Jewish reaction. The Zionist attitude was not to condemn anti-Semitism, not to fight or oppose anti-Semitism in the different ways that Jewish groups did, but to accept that the anti-Semites had a case. They accepted the premise of the anti-Semites, namely that the Jews did not belong in the countries where they lived. They were strangers, or as A.B. Yehoshua, a left Zionist novelist, said, they were guests in a hotel, other people's hotels, and they had outstayed their welcome. And the attitude to anti-Semitism was best summed up by Leo Pinsker, who said, and Pinsker founded the Lovers of Zion, Chovavei Zion, and he wrote in his book, Auto-Emancipation, Judeophobia, which was his term for anti-Semitism, is then a mental disease. And as a mental disease, it is hereditary. And having been inherited for 2,000 years, it is incurable. And that was a Zionist attitude. Anti-Semitism was an incurable disease. And we hear that today when we hear anti-Semitism being described as a virus. And of course, if it was incurable, then there was absolutely no point in trying to fight it. It was futile. And that was the position, for example, of Theodor Herzl, who's widely credited as being the founder of political Zionism. And he wrote in his 4-volume diaries, page 7, I think, in Paris, because he was a newspaper correspondent for the New Free Press, a Viennese newspaper. In Paris, I achieved a freer attitude towards anti-Semitism, which I now began to understand historically and to pardon. Above all, I recognized the emptiness and futility of trying to combat anti-Semitism. And this was really the starting point for the Zionist attitude to anti-Semitism. It was futile to oppose it. Indeed, they went one step further. They didn't simply think it was futile. They positively blamed the Jews themselves for creating anti-Semitism. Herzl, again, wrote in The Jewish State, his founding pamphlet, that the Jews, quote, naturally move to those places where we are not persecuted, and there our presence produces persecution. The unfortunate Jews are now carrying anti-Semitism into England. They have already introduced it into America, so, unquote. So you don't blame the societies which produce anti-Semitism, the social, economic conditions, the activities are racist, etc. What you do is blame the Jews. Their mere presence in other people's countries itself produces anti-Semitism. And therefore, the conclusion they drew was, of course, that Jews had to do what the anti-Semites wanted them to do, which was to emigrate, to go to Palestine and there to form a Jewish state. The Jewish Chronicle, incidentally, described Herzl's pamphlet, this is when the Jewish Chronicle was anti-Zionist, as an example of the odious theory, quote, that Jews only have to be numerous to believe to be hated. And Herzl himself was quite warm towards anti-Semitism. He believed it was divinely ordained, sent to preserve the Jews. And in his diaries, he writes, anti-Semitism too probably contains the divine will to good, because it forces us to close ranks, unites us through pressure, and through our unity will make us free. And so the Zionists adopted an attitude, I mean, like Jacob Klatskin, who was the editor of the Die Welt, their newspaper, and co-founder of Encyclopedia Judaica. He wrote, if we do not admit the rightfulness of anti-Semitism, we deny the rightfulness of our own nationalism. Instead of establishing societies for defense against the anti-Semites who want to reduce our rights, we should establish societies for defense against our friends who desire to defend our rights. So Zionism found itself in the position, although it was a reaction to anti-Semitism, of actually justifying anti-Semitism and blaming the Jews themselves. And Herzl wrote, and if I can just draw up this quotation, he wrote in The Jewish State, this is the founding pamphlet of Zionism. It was issued in 1795, I think, in the middle of the Dreyfus affair, about which Herzl writes absolutely nothing. He wrote, when we sink, we become a revolutionary proletariat. When we rise, there rises also our terrible power of the purse. In other words, he accepted the anti-Semitic stereotype that Jews had this terrible financial power. Pinchas Rosenblatt, who became the first Israeli Minister of Justice, described Palestine as an institute for the fumigation of Jewish vermin, unquote. And I'll quote Klatskin again, when he described the Jews as a people disfigured in both body and soul, in a word of a horror, some sort of outlandish creature, in any case not a pure national type, some sort of oddity among the people going by the name of Jew. And this was the Zionist attitude. They described the Jewish diaspora as the accursed galut. And this affected, of course, their whole attitude to anti-Semitism. I mean, it's believed, I mean, Zionism sought to create a Jewish state. But the reason they sought to create the Jewish state was not as a refuge or a sanctuary for Jews, but in order to perpetuate what they saw as the Jewish nation race. And I'll give a couple of examples, if I may. The first, and Professor Ger Alri, who is also at Tel Aviv University, described how, quote, Weizmann preferred productive immigrants over needy refugees and thought the land of Israel needed strong, healthy immigrants, not refugees who were murdered during this period. And you can find that in Haaretz of the 1st of December of last year. And thousands of Ukrainian Jews who were killed in the pogroms tried to actually escape in the early 1920s. and they were rejected by what became the Jewish Agency. It was then the Zionist organization, because they were the wrong type of Jews. They were weak. They didn't have any attachment to Zionism. They weren't the productive kind. The Zionist organization wanted either immigrants with capital, or they were young, strong, healthy pioneers. The disabled, the old, and so on were rejected. And this continued right into the Hitler period. I think we have to be quite clear about that. And indeed, during the Nazi period, let me just give you another example, which is a much later one. This is after the Holocaust. And this was in Argentina, where there was a neo-Nazi military junta from 1976 to 1983. Of the 30,000 or so Argentinians who were murdered, tortured, and disappeared by the junta, approximately 12.5%, over 3,000, were Jewish. But you wouldn't have heard that from what the propaganda that Israel regularly puts out about anti-Semitism in the world. Israel kept absolute silence. And why? Because Israel was the major arms trading nation, major supplier of arms and weaponry to the Argentinian junta. In fact, during the Falklands War, Israel supplied emergency equipment in order that it could conduct, or continue to conduct, their war with Britain. And the Israeli embassy, and I have a whole chapter in my book on Argentina. I can really only touch on it now because of time limitations. But the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires rejected Jews because they were considered by the junta subversive. So the idea that Israel is the refuge in times of anti-Semitism is a nonsense. And the reason why? Because a regime which is anti-Semitic is also going to be far right, semi-fascist, and it's going to be almost certainly in alliance with the United States. And for Israel, the alliance with the United States and imperialism trumps any concern with the Jews. Ben-Gurion was quite clear. David Ben-Gurion was the first prime minister, incidentally, of Israel. He made it quite clear that when there's a choice between the Jews and the Jewish state, then the interests of the Jewish state come first. And you can see that actually in Ukraine, where Israel has been supplying arms and weaponry and also training to the Azov Battalion, which is a neo-Nazi organization. I mean, I'm not going to go into the Ukrainian situation, simply to say that Israel has had no hesitation in working with neo-Nazi militias, and not just Ukraine either. Now, one of the essential characteristics of the Zionist attitude towards immigration during the Holocaust period was, and also before then, was called selectivity. In other words, you would choose out the immigrants you want. As I mentioned with Ukraine, they were healthy, they were young, or they had capital. And I'd like to quote from Chaim Cohen. And for here, I will need a little background. In Israel in 1954, between 1954 and 1958, the former leader of Hungarian Zionism, Rudolf Kastner, issued a libel action against a Hungarian refugee, Malchiel Greenwald. He was accused of being a collaborator, that he'd made an agreement with Eichmann in April 1944, that if Eichmann agreed to letting out 600, it later became 1,600 Jews, the Zionist elite, the Zionist and the Jewish elite from Hungary in a sealed train, then he would keep quiet about where the real destination of the Jews were, because they were told falsely that it was Kenya Mays, a place within Hungary. Indeed, they misinformed, Kastner's adjutants misinformed the Jews that they were going to a safe place, whereas of course they were going straight to Auschwitz via Slovakia. And Kastner, in that trial, the judge, Benjamin Halevi, found that the allegations against Kastner were basically true, that he had, in the words of the judge, sold his soul to Satan. He had reached, if you like, a devil's pact with Eichmann at the expense of 500,000 Hungarian Jews. Remember, this was 1944. Hungarian Jewry, which was about 750,000, was the last large Jewish community in Europe which had been relatively untouched by the Holocaust. And the Nazis, in a lightning operation between May and July, exterminated something like 430,000. And Kastner, say, was found to have collaborated in every sense of the word. Incidentally, although Yad Vashem has rehabilitated him, Yad Vashem is the Holocaust Propaganda Museum of the Zionists in Jerusalem, although they have rehabilitated him, there's absolutely no doubt that he was, in many ways, a war criminal as well as a collaborator. And many people think he was an agent of the Gestapo to boot. But the Israeli state appealed the verdict, which incidentally caused the fall of the second Israeli government under Moshe Sharett, the second Israeli prime minister under Moshe Sharett. Of course, you do not read about this now unless you dig into history books. And Chaim Cohen, who was the Attorney General, in his speech to the Supreme Court judges, argued why Kastner should be acquitted. And he said, if in Kastner's opinion, rightly or wrongly, he believed that 1 million Jews were hopelessly doomed, he was allowed not to inform them of their fate and concentrate on the saving of the few. He was entitled to make a deal with the Nazis for the saving of a few hundred, and entitled not to warn the millions. That was his duty. It has always been our Zionist tradition to select the few out of the many in arranging the immigration to Palestine. Are we to be called traitors? Well, the answer would be yes. And then he went on. Eichmann, the chief exterminator, knew that the Jews would be peaceful and not resist if he allowed the prominent Jews, to be saved, that the train of the prominents was organized on Eichmann's orders to facilitate the extermination of the whole people. If all the Jews of Hungary are to be sent to their death, he is entitled to organize a rescue train for 600 people. He is not only entitled to it, but is also bound to act accordingly. Of course, this was an absolute total lie in one sense. And if I can find it, I'll find the quote, which is from Eli Wiesel. No, I can't. Just give me 1 second. Yes. Eli Wiesel, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, but was an ardent Zionist, but he was also a survivor of Auschwitz. And his first book, The Night, is very well worth reading. There was an argument which has been propagandized by the Zionist historians, Yehuda Bor above all, but Gila Fatram, Dina Porat, and other historians at Yad Vashem, that the Hungarian Jews either did know, but it hadn't sunk in, or if they didn't know, there would have been nothing to do about it. But this was not true. I mean, Wiesel gives the example of his own maid, a non-Jewish maid, who said that she'd set up a refuge in her village in the mountains, and she was happy to take Eli Wiesel, but his family didn't believe her because they had no information about Auschwitz. And so he went with his father and family to Auschwitz, only he survived. And he asked, why didn't we know? To this day, I try to understand what happened. If ever there was a tragedy that could have been prevented, it was that one. And then I want to come on briefly to Havara, because I know I'm probably running out of time as I speak. Havara the argument have arisen was the trading agreement that the Zionists proposed to the Nazis and which was agreed in August 1933. And it was very simple. The Reichsmarks which the Jews had were put in a frozen account. And they were used by the Zionists. Two companies were set up, Havara Limited and Paltrow Limited, in order to purchase with these frozen marks German machinery and other goods, which were then exported to Palestine. So there was no hard currency involved, but the internal market, if you like, the internal marks within Germany were then used to provide exports to Palestine. And this was no mere affair, no trifling. 60% of the capital investment in the Jewish Palestinian economy between 1933 and 1939 came from Nazi Germany as a result of Havara. So it played a very major part in the building up of the Israeli state. And you have to see it in a context, because almost as soon as the almost as soon as Hitler came to power in January 1933, there was an instinctive reaction from Jews worldwide to boycott Germany. You didn't need to tell people; they did it automatically, even though it was often badly coordinated. And so the opposition, the support for the boycott amongst the Jews was overwhelming, with two exceptions: the Zionist movement and the Jewish bourgeoisie, who prioritized their own trading relationships over the fate of German Jewry. But the Zionists from the start opposed the boycott. They said it was, quote, un-Zionist. And they were interested, as I say, in organizing this very profitable Havara trading agreement with Nazi Germany. But what it certainly wasn't about was saving Jews. If anything, it probably worked in the opposite way. Firstly, about 20,000 of the 50,000 German Jews who went to Palestine actually went under Havara. That is a minority. Secondly, in order to qualify, you had to have £1,000 in capital in order to enter Palestine, because you didn't need what you call an immigration certificate. So the other 30,000 went through the immigration certificates that the Zionist organization issued in agreement with the British. And the other 20,000 entered on a Class A visa, namely they didn't need an immigration certificate because they had £1,000, which today is worth £70,000. There is no doubt whatsoever that anyone with that amount of capital, and that wasn't all they had, because of course they also had capital to purchase the goods, would have been able to obtain sanctuary in very many other countries which were welcoming people with capital. So the idea that Havara saved Jews is simply not true. But even worse, the Zionist organization lobbied through its agents, Feivel Polks in particular, Haganah agents, Haganah being a Zionist terror group. He also seems to have offered to spy for Nazi Germany on behalf of Haganah, incidentally. They pressurized the Nazis, and the Gestapo in particular, to restrict German Jewish immigration to Palestine and only Palestine. And what was the logic of this? Again, it's regarding the Evian conference. People may or may not know, but in 1938, Roosevelt proposed a conference which was held in the spa town in France of Evian, which was concerned with dealing with the Jewish refugee question. I have to say that it was really a face-saving exercise, because countries were invited on the basis that they actually didn't have to change their existing policy of refusing the refugees. And Sykes wrote, from the start, they regarded the whole enterprise with hostile indifference. If the 31 nations had done their duty and shown hospitality to those in dire need, then the pressure on a national home and the heightened enthusiasm of Jews with Palestine would both have been relaxed. This was the last thing that the Zionists wished for. Even in the more terrible days ahead, they made no secret of the fact, even when talking to Gentiles, non-Jews, that they did not want Jewish settlements outside Palestine to be successful. The Zionists wanted to do something more for Jews than merely helping them to escape danger. That such was the basic Zionist idea is not a matter of opinion, but a fact abundantly provable by evidence. And I'm wondering if I can share my screen. So if you give me a minute, I don't know whether Becky, you have to allow. Oh yes, there it is. Okay, that's fine. I want to, can people see it on the screen? You're probably better than me. It's a quote from Boaz Evron, who's an Israeli journalist and writer. And he describes in a pamphlet exactly what happened. And he says, he quotes from a letter. Can everybody see that? Haim, can you see that? Yeah. He quotes from a letter by George Landor, who was in charge of the settlement of German Jews in Palestine, to Stephen Weiss, who was the leader of American Zionists, dated February the 13th, 1938. That is the time of the Evian conference. Quote, I'm writing this letter at the request of Dr. Weizmann. Haim Weizmann was the first president of Israel, because we're extremely concerned lest the problem, that's the problem of Jewish refugees, be presented in a way which could prejudice the activity for Eretz Yisrael, that is Jewish Palestine. Even if the conference does not propose immediately after its opening other countries, but Eretz Yisrael as venues for Jewish immigration, it will certainly arouse a public response that could put the importance of Eretz Yisrael in the shade. We are particularly worried that it would move Jewish organizations to collect large sums of money for aid to Jewish refugees, and these collections could interfere with our collection efforts. There is also a statement by Menachem Asishkin, who was a Russian Zionist and the Zionist executive, in the meeting of the Jewish Agency's executive on the 26th of June 38, quote, he is highly concerned at the Evian conference. Mr. Greenbaum, another member of the Zionist executive, is right in stating that there is a danger that the Jewish people also will take Eretz Yisrael off its agenda, and this should be viewed by us as a terrible danger. He hoped to hear in Evian that Eretz Yisrael remains the main venue for Jewish immigration. All other emigration countries do not interest him. The greatest danger is that attempts will be made to find other territories for Jewish immigration. And the account of Ben-Gurion's statement at the same meeting, quote, no rationalization can turn the conference from a harmful one to a useful one. What can and should be done is to limit the damage as far as possible. He doesn't know, quote, whether the Evian conference will open the gates of other countries to Jewish immigration. But like Greenbaum and Asishkin, he fears at this time the conference is liable to cause immense harm to Eretz Yisrael and Zionism. And it was summed up in the meeting that the Zionist thing to do is to belittle the conference as far as possible and to cause it to decide nothing. I mean, that, I think, is pretty clear. The main danger, as far as Zionism is concerned, was not that Jews would have to stay in Germany or would be annihilated. The main danger was that other countries would open their gates and their doors and they might be saved. And this was the absurdity. But from a Zionist point of view, it wasn't an absurdity. This reason. Their project was to create a Jewish state. It was nothing to do with anti-Semitism. The main goal was a Jewish state. Now, if other countries could rescue Jews, they asked themselves, what was the purpose of a Jewish state? Clearly, there wasn't one. The British were not allowing immigration beyond 15,000 a year after 1939. So, I mean, there was a problem. And the Zionists fought tooth and nail to actually prevent other immigration schemes taking off. The one offer Evian was Santo Domingo, which offered 100,000 places. The Zionists did their best to undermine it. Or Alaska. It was proposed that Jews go to Alaska, which was one part of the United States, which didn't have immigration controls because it's sparsely settled and they wanted more people. Stephen Weiss, the leader of American Zionism, turned it down. He said, it's far too cold in Alaska for European Jews. But as we know, when the Jews perished in the gas chambers and were burnt in the crematoria, it was anything but cold. But the Zionist attitude was saving the Jews, campaigning it for their rescue, was a distraction. It diverted money from their own coffers, money to buy and purchase land for settlements. And rescuing Jews paled in comparison, compared with that. And then there's two quotes which I think emphasize this by Ben Gurion. And again, I'll just search for it.
Tony,
yeah, I am running out of time.
You actually ran out of time, but I'm really loath to stop you speaking.
Okay,
So
I shall
give it
finish in 5 minutes.
7 minutes, yeah?
Yeah, that's fine. In a speech to Mapai, that's the Israeli Labour Party Central Committee on the 9th of December 1938, which was a month after Kristallnacht, he said about the British proposal to allow 10,000 Jewish children in, unaccompanied, from Germany. If I knew that it would be possible to save all the children in Germany by bringing them over to England, and only half of them by transporting them to Eretz Yisrael, then I would opt for the second alternative. But we must weigh not only the life of these children, but also the history of the people of Israel. And you can find that amongst other places in the official biography of Ben Gurion by Shabtai Teva. So there's no doubt that it was genuine. And he went on to write in the memo to the Zionist executive of the 17th of December 1938, quote, if the Jews are faced with the choice between the refugee problem and rescuing Jews from concentration camps on the one hand, and aid for the National Museum in Palestine on the other, the Jewish sense of pity will prevail, and our people's entire strength will be directed at aid for the refugees in the various countries. Zionism will vanish from the agenda, and indeed not only world public opinion in England and America, but also from Jewish public opinion. We are risking Zionism's very existence if we allow the refugee problem to be separated from the Palestine problem. In other words, they were opposed to what they called refugeeism. If people were to be rescued as refugees, then it had to be Palestine or nowhere. And of course, in most cases, it was nowhere. I mean, I don't have time to maybe go through everything that I could say, but the Nazi party, I mean, this relates to Ken Livingstone, the Nazi government, was extremely sympathetic and supportive of the Zionist movement. Das Schwarze Korps, the paper of the SS, Heydrich wrote, the Nazi government is in agreement with a great spiritual movement within Jewry itself. Zionism's position is based on the recognition of the unity of Jewry throughout the world and the recognition of all ideas of mixing in. So the Zionists, alone amongst the Jews, welcomed the Nuremberg laws, which divided Germany into two. It simply rendered the Jews stateless and without a nationality. And Heydrich, on the 28th of January 1935, Heydrich was a deputy to Himmler, by the way. He was described as the engineer of the final solution. He said, the activity of the Zionist-oriented youth organizations that were engaged in the occupational restructuring of the Jews for agriculture and manual trades prior to their emigration to Palestine lies in the interest of the National Socialist State's leadership. So we have, for example, anti-Zionist youth groups were outlawed in 1936. The Zionist youth groups continued legally until 1939. And lest anyone imagine that somehow that the Zionists were intent on using Havara to save Jews, or they were interested in saving Germany's Jews for its own sake. I only have to quote David Werner Senator, another member of the Jewish Agency Executive, who warned that if the German Zionists, quote, did not improve the quality of the, quote, human material, unquote, they were sending, the number of immigration certificates would be cut. So the Zionists themselves were absolutely clear. They did not want unrestricted immigration of anyone, the feeble, the unemployed, what they considered work shy, etc. They simply wanted young candidates and nothing more. So really, I have to stop there because I've run out of time. Simply to say, maybe just the one thing I will say is that the Zionist attitude to the rise of the Nazis was absolutely unique. I mean, I described the attitude of most Jews to boycott Germany as soon as the Nazis rose to power, but this was not the attitude of the Zionist movement. They saw great opportunities involved in what was happening in Germany, and this was summed up by Burl Katznelson, a founder of Mapai and editor of their paper Davar, as well as Ben-Gurion's effective deputy. He described the rise of Hitler as, quote, an opportunity to build and flourish like none we have ever had or ever will have. And indeed, Ben-Gurion was even more optimistic. Quote, the Nazis' victory would become, quote, a fertile force for Zionism, unquote. And the leader, one of the leaders of German Zionism, Rabbi Joachim Prinz, admitted that it was morally disturbing, quote, to seem to be considered as the favored children of the Nazi government, particularly when it dissolved the anti-Zionist youth groups and seemed in other ways to prefer the Zionists. The Nazis asked for a more Zionist behavior, unquote. So when it comes to Ken Livingstone, of course, he was absolutely correct in what he said. In fact, he underplayed it, if anything. So I'm sorry, really what I have to say is just a fraction of what is in my book, and some of it will, I think, shock you. But the idea that somehow the Zionists were horrified at the time by the Holocaust is simply not true. If anything, they did their best to actually keep it quiet. But I simply don't have the time now to go into that. So thank you very much for listening to me. My book will be out hopefully next week. There's been a problem with the printers because they got one or two things wrong, but the book will be out either next week or at the latest the week after. I think you know details. It's on my blog amongst other places as to how to get it. So I warmly recommend it to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Tony, for an amazing masterly performance. And even Tony is unable to sum up his book in 45 minutes. It is impossible indeed. The book is about 450 pages. It is speaking about every aspect of the relationship between Zionism and Nazism. It is a source book that is very crucial for anyone that wants to understand or to explain to others how Zionism found it in itself to be so supportive of the most anti-Semitic example that we have before us even today. So I will now allow people to ask questions. Please be as brief as you can so that other people will have a chance to also ask questions. And the first one is David Cannon.
Oh, thank you, Tony. Thank you very much. Your meticulous research has exposed not only Zionist priority to establish Israel, not to save Jewish lives, but also to expose how Nazis supported Zionism as a way of contributing to ethnic cleansing. My question is, to what extent do you think that the United Nations recognition of the establishment of Israel after the Second World War also was motivated by anti-Semitism, in that they did not want Jewish refugees coming to the UK, the USA, other countries? They preferred the idea of Israel. Thank you very much, Tony.
Haim, can I just say, I've promoted some people to panelists. We can let them ask their questions, and then I'll remove them from the panel while you answer. So I have got 2 people up there to ask a question.
Satish Sekar, could you ask your question?
Yeah, my question is, while I appreciate what you have done in highlighting what's happened during the war and how it led to the Holocaust, what about beforehand? Because you had quite a bit of anti-Semitism, for example, in Britain and in France in particular. The birth of Zionism came from the infamous case of Alfred Dreyfus in France, and he opposed it. This is where Herzl was supposed to have got the idea that it had to be the Zionist solution. And in England, there was a number of issues of radical people coming over from the former Russian Empire, and anti-Semitism was used against them when they were fighting against the Russian Empire in Britain. Did that play any part, or do you see that as contributing to the problems that Zionism has caused?
And the third person is Dorian Paul Dixon. Would you please ask your questions, Dorian?
I'm just going to say I'm a huge fan of David Rosenberg and a huge fan of Tony. But when I was a kid, I went to see a film called Exodus. And I would love to hear Tony's opinion on how that narrative seems to have been blanked out. I'm sorry for the trouble with my webcam. My cat knocks it over quite often.
Okay, Tony, take it away. First 3.
Right, okay, fine. The first one was David Cannon's, I believe. He asked, UN recognition, was it motivated by anti-Semitism? That was certainly the opinion of Ernest Bevin, because he came out, there was immense pressure to admit 100,000 Jewish refugees to Palestine. There's a lot of information, not least by Tom Suarez, about the activities of Haganah in the displaced persons camps in Europe, in intimidating and in some cases beating up and so on Jewish refugees, Holocaust survivors who didn't want to go to Palestine. But Bevin came out, the foreign secretary, and said the reason why the Americans want to establish an Israeli, a Jewish state, is because they don't want them in America. And of course, he was bitterly criticized, accused of being anti-Semitic, but it was true, of course, because when America moved to liberalize its immigration laws, the Zionists in America, the United States, fought bitterly against such a liberalization. And they turned on fellow Jews who supported lowering the immigration barriers, like Morris Ernst, savagely. Indeed, I know of no example in the United States or Britain where the Zionists supported and campaigned for the lowering of the immigration barriers, which was the obvious thing to do. At no point and at no time did they do that. Quite the contrary, they were very, very happy with immigration laws directed at the Jews. After all, remember in 1903, when the British were thinking of introducing the first anti-alien legislation, Theodore Herzl travelled to Britain to testify before the Royal Commission as to why it was a good idea, because they too were opposed to Jewish refugees entering Britain. they also believed that they should go to Palestine. Now, as it happens, I mean, something like 2.5 million Jewish refugees emigrated from Tsarist Russia, a combination of pogroms, poverty, and so on. Barely 1% of those went to Palestine of their own free will, so they had to coerce them. The same was true of the Soviet Jewry campaign. They wanted the Soviet Jews to leave the Soviet Union, but they didn't want them to go to anywhere but Israel. So they campaigned again for the Americans not to admit them quite openly. Begin traveled to America in order to persuade, I think it was Reagan, not to allow them in without visas and so on. So, I mean, this has always been the attitude of Zionism. It doesn't support the idea of a Jewish diaspora. And indeed, it will act against the interests of the diaspora whenever it feels necessary. And it's doing that now in Bosnia. There's a proposal for a law which would prevent Jews and other minorities from even standing for certain elections. It would either be Serbs or Croats or Muslims who could, but Jews, being a small minority, wouldn't be able to. Israel has supported that law over the protests of the Bosnian Jewish community. So that gives you just an example. Now, Satish asked about Dreyfus. Yes, there is a myth that Dreyfus was motivated by what happened in the Dreyfus affair. And people remember that a captain in the French army, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, was accused of treason based on forged letters and perjury, and he was imprisoned on Devil Island. I think it was until 1900. But, you know, I mean, anyone who looked at the situation would have drawn inspiration, because here was half of French society and more actively campaigning on behalf of a Jewish person who'd been falsely imprisoned. I mean, the anti-Dreyfusards, led by Edward Drumont, who published the anti-Semitic paper La Libre Parole, were outgunned and outmaneuvered and out-campaigned because the evidence became increasingly clear that Dreyfus was innocent. But was Herzl motivated by it? Well, look at his first pamphlet, say issued in 1895, The Jewish State. There isn't one single mention of the Dreyfus affair, which was raging in France. If you read through his diaries, 4-volume diaries, over 1,500 pages, and I have done so, there is barely a mention of the Dreyfus affair. And when he does mention it, it is in passing. The Dreyfus affair did not concern him. This was a legend created after the event. It certainly didn't take place at the time. And you know, Herzl in many ways shared Drumont's antagonism to French Jewry. He wrote, "I took a look at the Paris Jews and saw a family likeness in their faces. Bold, misshapen noses, furtive and cunning eyes." And in Austria too, anti-Semites were finding ammunition in Herzl's arguments, as would the followers of Drumont. Herzl badgered his friend Alphonse Daudet, who was also an anti-Semite, to get him, that is Drumont, to favourably review the Jewish State's pamphlet in his paper La Libre Parole. And in fact, Drumont did. He did favourably review it. And Herzl expressed his delight with the review in his diary. And you can go to it, I think, page 251. In fact, Herzl wrote a pamphlet, Mauschel, in the Zionist paper Die Welt, which was an attack on anti-Zionists that really was a summary of every single anti-Semitic stereotype of Jews. I mean, the Zionists, again, don't mention this. So there is no doubt whatsoever as to their attitude. But I mean, let me give you another example in Britain, somewhat later. Haim Weizmann, the president of the Zionist organization, settled here and was responsible for negotiating the Balfour Declaration. Now, at that time, there was an anti-Semitic movement, mainly based in the East End, It was created by William Evans Gordon MP, the leader of the British Brothers League, who was, quote, widely and unfavourably known to the Jewish people. He was anti-Semitic, he was a right-wing Tory, something like Enoch Powell. And the British Brothers League was the precursor of the British Union of Fascists in the 1930s. But Weizmann wrote in his autobiography, Trial and Error, and I quote, "Our people were rather hard on him. The Alien Bill in England and the movement which grew around it were natural phenomena which might have been foreseen. Sir William Evans Gordon had no particular anti-Jewish prejudices. He acted as he thought, according to his best light, and in the most kindly way in the interest of his country. He was sincerely ready to encourage any settlement of Jews almost anywhere in the British Empire, but he failed to see why the ghettos of London or Leeds or Whitechapel should be made into a branch of the ghettos of Warsaw and Pinsk." So I mean, here you have it. I mean, a complete whitewashing of the leading anti-Semitic leader of the time. And it wasn't surprising because William Evans Gordon was also a supporter of the Zionists. And indeed, its president, William Stanley Shaw, I dug this up in the Jewish Chronicle archives, wrote in a letter to the Jewish Chronicle, "I am a firm believer in the Zionist movement, which the British Brothers League will do much incidentally to foster. The return of the Jews to Palestine is one of the most striking signs of the times. All students of prophecy are watching the manifold signs of the times with almost breathless interest." Stanley Shaw was a dispensationalist Christian, a Christian Zionist, so that fitted in very well. As regards the third question, I have to say I haven't watched the film Exodus, so I can't really answer a lot, but it was part and parcel of the Zionist propaganda at the time. And of course, it was made into a propaganda film, the idea that a Jewish Palestine, would be a safeguard against future anti-Semitism. Of course, we know that isn't the case now, and Israel has really very little interest in genuine anti-Semitism, which is why they redefined it in terms of the IHRA definition, which talks about Israel, not genuine anti-Semitism. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. It's really great to see so many friends here waiting to speak and in the public of this webinar. Don't worry, all of you will be called and it will take some time because these are complicated questions. The next one is Maureen Purcell. Please unmute.
It's actually Peter rather than Maureen. Peter Jane. Hi, Tony. Thank you for writing the book and also your presentation. So rather than focus on the content of the book, I'd like to know what your hopes are for its role in supporting the Palestinian cause. How do you see it fitting in into our campaigning?
The next one is Diana Neslin.
Okay, Tony. I was most impressed with the evidence that you have produced, but I'm also so aware of the terror that everyone has of actually discussing and opening up the issue of Zionism and the difficulty you had of getting this book published, which is, I still have Lenny Brenner's book. But, and I remember Perdition, which was which was taken off the as a play because it actually dealt with Kastner. But what I really wanted to discuss further is the whole idea that is being promulgated that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, when I believe that it's just the opposite. Zionism has a symbiotic relationship with anti-Semitism, and it's so seldom actually mentioned. Even when people talk about Zionism, they seldom talk about the symbiotic relationship and the need, two sides of the same coin, the need of both sides for each other. It's been a consistent pattern throughout the history of Zionism. I'd like your comment on that.
Thank you, Diana. And the last one on this round is the famous researcher Stanley Heller.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks for this presentation and your book. My question goes back to 1936 and to Britain, the Battle of Cable Street. I understand that was a very important event in the fight against British fascism. To what extent did the Zionists in Britain participate in this Battle of Cable Street?
Tony?
Yes, okay. I'll take the questions in the reverse order, if that's okay, because that way I'll at least remember one of them. Stanley's asks about the Battle of Cable Street, which, for people who don't know, the British Union of Fascists under Sir Oswald Mosley intended to march through the East End of London. And contrary to the Zionist idea that anti-Semitism was eternal, natural, and a property of the Gentiles, something like 200,000 demonstrators, mainly non-Jewish, Irish Catholic dockers, who'd often themselves been anti-Semitic and or there was a legacy of anti-Semitism, came out on the streets to repulse Mosley. In fact, Mosley never got anywhere near because the fighting was with the police, who, of course, as they have always done, tried to march the fascists through until they gave up. So that was called the Battle of Cable Street. Now, you would imagine that the Board of Deputies of British Jews, which is very concerned about anti-Semitism today, so concerned that in, March 2018, it held an anti-racist demo, or that's what it called it, outside the Houses of Parliament, against Jeremy Corbyn's anti-Semitism. Some people may remember this. Such luminaries as Norman Tebbit and Ian Paisley Jr. took part in this anti-racist demo. What you won't be surprised to hear, or you may be surprised, is this was the first such demonstration against racism. The Board of Deputies has never organised a demonstration against racism. And when it came to the Battle of Cable Street, there were big ads and posters in the Jewish Chronicle saying, don't go, don't provoke them, stay at home, etc. The vast majority of Jews, of course, ignored the Board of Deputies, and it was entirely discredited as a result of that. But the Board of Deputies simply was not interested in opposing fascism. Now, it was under the anti-Zionist bourgeois Jews then, but the Zionist organizations were of the same mind, apart from a few fringe, if you like, leftist Zionists. The Zionists totally agreed that fighting anti-Semitism wasn't their task. After all, Zionism wasn't there to fight against anti-Semitism. And the Labour Zionists, who claim today the mantle of fighting at Cable Street, I mean, were extremely weak, almost non-existent in the East End, partly because the Zionist Federation itself didn't want what they called the mob to be involved in their affairs. They preferred more genteel elements. They were trying to win over the Jewish bourgeoisie. And so they didn't want working class Jews in any way, but they had very little purchase and certainly no involvement in the organization. That was the Communist Party, the Independent Labour Party, and the Jewish People's Council. So I hope I've answered that. Diana Neslin, I mean, what can one say? I mean, let me give you a quote. It's from Joachim Doran, Classic Zionism and Its Enemies. It's in the Journal of Israeli History, Volume 4. So it comes from quite a good source. When he describes how, quote, rather than take up arms against the enemies of the Jews, Zionism attacked, quote, the enemy within, the diaspora Jew himself, and subjected him to a hail of criticism. Then he goes on, indeed, the perusal of Zionist sources reveals criticism so scathing that the generation that witnessed Auschwitz has difficulty comprehending them, unquote. Now, I've given you different quotes about the Jews, the diaspora Jews being vermin and so on and so forth, but there were other quotes I could have put before you. But the fact is that the Zionist attitude to the Jewish diaspora and its problems was really that it would use them at best for its own advantage, but it wasn't concerned with anti-Semitism itself. Zionism has never, ever fought anti-Semitism. Zionists individually have, and I think you always have to make a distinction between the individual and the movement, but the movement never did. So, I mean, in the Warsaw Ghetto, Hashoma Hatzair provided a number of fighters led by Mordechai Neilowitz, but they didn't do it because they were Zionists. They did it because, in spite of the fact that they were Zionists, and indeed some of them, Heike Klinger, for example, went back to Palestine, and I could quite, such as Klinger, but others, Sylvia Altman, they were instructed by their youth organizations in Palestine not to take part in the resistance, and instead to go by Aliyah Bet, the secret illegal immigration, to Palestine to join what they said was the real fight. And that is the problem. Since I've mentioned Heike Klinger, made a speech in 1944 when she went to Palestine to the executive of Histadrut, which is the main Zionist, well, so-called trade union, but it was really a general colonizing agency. And she described the Judenrat, the Jewish councils, which collaborated with the Nazis, sometimes, of course, involuntarily, as having become, quote, tools of suppression in the hands of the authorities. They played, quote, an abject role in the destruction of the Jews. Although members of the Judenrat had not at first known what the Nazis' intentions were, there were instances of clear knowledge, and they lied accordingly to the deportees. He told the executive that the various communities in Europe were headed by members of the Zionist movement, and most of them understood that if the Nazis said A, they would need to carry on and do B. And after they began assisting the Nazis to collect gold and furniture from Jewish homes, they had no choice but to help them to prepare the lists of Jews for labor camps. And precisely because those who stood at the head of most of the communities were Zionists, the psychological effect on most of the Jewish masses vis-a-vis the Zionist idea was devastating, and the hatred towards Zionism grew day by day. One bright day, we will need to try these people. It must be said clearly and publicly that many Zionists betrayed their people. And the author of the book, Dan Porat, simply writes, members of the Zionist movement, Klinger believed, played a disproportionately large role in the leadership of European Jews under the Nazis. And then a post-war survey finds that that was about 2/3 of the Judenrat were Zionists. Diane's point, again, I think I'll quote from A.B. Yehoshua. He's just died. He was an Israeli novelist. He very much believed in the negation of the diaspora, but he was an honest person who spoke the truth. And in a lecture to the Union of Jewish Students on the 22nd of January 1982, so that's 40 years ago, he told them some home truths. He said, anti-Zionism is not the product of the non-Jews. On the contrary, the Gentiles have always encouraged Zionism, hoping that it would help rid them of the Jews in their midst. Even today, in a perverse way, a real anti-Semite must be a Zionist. And that's really the point I'm making. Anti-Semitism and Zionism are twins of a kind, two sides of the same coin. The anti-Semites want Jews out of the countries where they live, and the Zionists say, yes, we're only too happy to have them. Anti-Zionism, on the contrary, is a form of anti-racism. There is no crossover between anti-Zionism, which is opposition to the apartheid state of Israel and Jewish supremacy in Israel, and anti-Semitism. I mean, it's certainly the case that there are few anti-Semites who use support of Palestine as a cover for their activities. But you know, there's a much, much larger proportion of anti-Semites who use their support for Israel as a cover for anti-Semitism. Look at Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, Viktor Orban, Richard Spencer, the leader, the founder of the alt-right in America, a neo-Nazi. He describes himself as a white Zionist. Tommy Robinson's another Zionist. So when it comes to anti-Semites, most of them are also Zionists. There are very, very few examples of anti-Semites who are anti-Zionist or support the Palestinians. Indeed, I would say if you're an anti-Semite, you can't be an anti-Zionist. So I hope I've dealt with that one. What relationship does this have, my book have, to the campaigning around Palestine? Well, I think one major way is it actually means that you can deconstruct and you can argue back. But when the Zionists use the Holocaust, like in Germany, for example, where they use the historic legacy of German anti-Semitism and the Holocaust to render the Palestine solidarity movement illegal, I think we have to tell them some truth and actually say to the German government, your support for Zionism today is actually no different from the Nazi government's support for Zionism 80 years ago. You're not opposing anti-Semitism, on the contrary, you're encouraging it. And it's no surprise that when the Bundestag moved the motion, the original motion, to condemn BDS, boycott, divestment and sanctions, it was the far-right alternative for Germany, which contains a host of neo-Nazis in it, which was the most vociferous opponent of BDS. They wanted to make support for BDS illegal outright. I mean, it's becoming that way now in Germany. But so today, I mean, it's the neo-Nazis who are often the best friends of the Israeli state. And that is the irony of the creation of a state, which is based on ethno-religious nationalism. After all, if you are a white supremacist, I mean, what is there not to like about the Israeli state today?
Thanks, Tony. Just to remind people, Zionism has always treated anti-Semitism as its recruiting sergeant. At the moment, more or less, that the Bataclan incident has finished in Paris, Netanyahu appeared there, and instead of saying, let us fight anti-Semitism in France, he said, come to Israel, we are waiting for you. In the same way, they did anything apart from dancing in the streets when the war started in Ukraine, because all of a sudden they could look forward to Jews from both Ukraine and Russia coming to Israel, which indeed has happened in great numbers. So, you know, trouble, anti-Semitism, racism, tragedy of any kind is quite welcome in Jerusalem. Now,
Can I just add to that very briefly? When the Tree of Life, the bombing of the synagogue, the murder of 11 Jews in the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh took place, Avi Gabbay from the Israeli Labour Party, the leader, told the Jews, again, to come to Israel, which he said was your real home. In other words, you didn't really belong in the first place in the United States.
Now, please look at the chat where Tony's email is mentioned. If you want to buy the book, which I hope you do, and you should, please send Tony an email and he will arrange this. Thanks for Stanley Heller for also giving us a link to Tony's article about the Cable Street event, which is mentioned there. And the next question is from Steve, my eyesight, Steve Byrne.
All right, Tony. Yeah, I was just going to ask you, earlier you mentioned Thomas Suarez's book, State of Terror. And I read that sort of fairly recently, and he describes he describes the fact that the Zionist terror groups assassinated hundreds of non-Zionist or anti-Zionist Jews in British Mandate Palestine. But also he mentions the efforts by the Leahy to recruit the Italian fascists. And there was the Jerusalem Agreement of 1940, in which they proposed that they proposed that the Italian fascists help them overthrow the British in Palestine, and in quotations, liquidate the Jewish diaspora and destroy all non-Palestinian Jewish communities on the Leahy's behalf. and help to forcibly transfer their populations to the Zionist settlements. So it's something that I mean, I wonder if you could just speak a bit more about the relationship of the Zionists with the Italian fascists. Is that something that's mentioned in your book?
Tony, there is another question from Susan Cox, which is asking, is Zionism itself racist? I'm sure you would like to answer that one. Okay,
on the Italian fascists, it was the revisionist Zionists, Gun, who established Betar, their youth group, who established relationships in, I think, 1935 with Mussolini and the Italian fascists. And their naval cadets trained at Civitavecchia, which is in the middle of Italy, at the naval training station there. And some of them, Admiral Blas, I think, Abram Blas, later became an admiral in the Israeli Navy. So there were very close relations between the Italian fascists and the revisionist Zionists. However, it became impossible after the 1938 race laws that Mussolini introduced because of the conflict in Abyssinia to continue there. So they transferred to the anti-Semitic regime in Poland, who again allowed them to train, and they were armed and equipped as well. What I think I'm certainly not aware there were hundreds of Jews who were killed non-Zionist Jews who were killed. There was certainly a targeted assassination in 1924, and I can't remember his name now, but he was the secretary of Agudat Yisrael, which was the Orthodox Jewish organization set up to oppose Zionism, though now today Agudat Yisrael is in the Knesset, so it has changed somewhat. But their leader was actually gay. He wasn't particularly religious. He was a Dutch poet. Sorry, it's just slipped my mind. He was assassinated. Jacob de Haan. That's right. Yes, that's right. Jacob de Haan. He was assassinated, but that was by Haggadah, not by the revisionists. I'm not aware of any assassination, but I mean, there may have been. Who knows? You're referring to an agreement in 1940-41. I think what you're doing is referring to the Stern Gang, which was a breakaway from Irgun Beer, as it was called, which twice made an offer via emissaries to Nazi Germany, not Italy, to support them in the war as long as they would help establish a totalitarian Jewish state. It's covered by Lenny Brenner in one of his books, so I haven't spent too much time on it. Just to say that when the Zionists refer to the Mufti of Jerusalem, the Palestinian leader who negotiated with Hitler, I mean, Netanyahu tried to blame him for the Holocaust, even though the Mufti was never elected by the Palestinians. He was imposed by the British and the Zionist High Commissioner, Sir Herbert Samuel. They never mentioned the fact that the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Shamir, was one of the leaders of the Stern Gang at the time the offer was made to the Nazis. This offer was only discovered because files were captured in the Turkish, the German embassy in Ankara. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been known. Susan Cox asks a different question. Is Zionism inherently racist? It's a very good question as well. I would say yes, it is, because it othered, for a start, the Jewish people. It exceptionalized them. It placed them outside normal human society. It rendered them everything that the anti-Semites said. So its attitude to Jewish people was thoroughly anti-Semitic. It was seen as a form of Jewish anti-Semitism when it arose. I mean, Theodor Herzl writes in his diaries about how, because he traveled all over Europe meeting royalty and aristocracy, and he met the Grand Duke of Baden, who was the leader of a principality then. It wasn't part of a unified Germany, I don't think. He was the uncle of the Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm. And Herzl asked him for his support, and the Grand Duke said, yes, of course, I'm more than willing to give you my support, but I just have one reservation, that if I support your Zionist movement, people are going to accuse me of anti-Semitism. And that was how it was seen. If you supported Zionism, it was because you were anti-Semitic. And indeed, I mean, the Zionists don't publicize this much, but the first Zionist Congress was in Basel in Switzerland. Why? Because the Jews of Munich, where it was supposed to be held, rose up in rebellion and accused the authorities of anti-Semitism and demanded that it be moved. They wouldn't have it. So, I mean, today, when Zionism has conquered the Jewish communities or diaspora, to some extent, though it may be losing its grip in places like the United States, you should bear in mind that, of course, Zionism, when it originally appeared on the scene, was opposed by virtually every strand of Jewish opinion, bar the Zealots themselves. Orthodox Jewry opposed it, and the bourgeois anti-Zionists opposed it because it threatened their status in the countries they lived. So, but this history, of course, has been written out, and mainstream historians aren't willing to engage in difficult questions. But or maybe I could just add one final rider to that. I mean, I say in my book that even if the Zionist movement had aimed to colonize an empty Pacific island, I would still oppose it because it's the wrong solution to anti-Semitism. But because it allied itself with the imperialist powers and sought an alliance, it was inevitably, inherently racist. It had to be. It could be no other.
Thank you, Tony. You're not done yet. There's another trio coming up. Noel Hamill, please ask your question.
My question was about Israel, Zionism, and propaganda. If you look at the history of Israel and Zionism, it is peppered with contradictions, absurdities, so much so that it's almost surprising it's not laughed out of court. But if we look at more recent events, like the anti-Semitic accusations leveled at the Labour Party at the time of Jeremy Corbyn, and another issue that concerns me is Holocaust memorials. Now, the Holocaust wasn't only about the Jews and Auschwitz, it was mass murder, fascist mass murder on a vast scale. And the Holocaust memorials don't represent that fairly. They're biased towards the Jewish events in European Jews events in Auschwitz and the gas chambers. There was much, much more. And really, if we're going to understand the Holocaust and fascism properly, we need to get a better representation of the Holocaust. We eventually will, in this country, get a Holocaust memorial, justifiably so, but we do need a better presentation, don't we? There's your question.
And the next one is by Verena Rajab.
Thank you very much to Tony and to Haim for your great work. We hope that it will help us in Germany to stop or to do something valuable against the misuse of the anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism accusation, which is very dangerous, above all if it happens in a country like Germany. I have a question about the boycott in 1933, when the Nazis came to power. There was an international boycott. I think it was very strong, and it promised to have really effect against the Nazis. who were not so strong in their position in this early phase. And I'm interested to know how it was possible to stop this strong movement and to render dominant the Ha'abara agreement, which really helped the Nazis to stay in power. And perhaps Tony could also say something about the weapons delivery from the young Federal Republic of Germany to Israel. It started before the diplomatic relationship between the two states. I think it also helped many brown persons who managed to gain the new positions in the young Federal Republic of Germany, and it would be interesting if you could say something about that.
And there is another question by Yar Peretz. Yar, please unmute.
Hello. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
First, I really want to thank Haim and Tony for a brilliant presentation. It was amazing, and I really hope that we can continue this give and take about the possible connections between Zionism and early Zionism and Nazism and anti-Semitism and the contemporary present-day implications. I think it's so important, and it can really power up our movement, our solidarity, our boycott, divestment, and sanction campaign. And that brings me to my question, which might be a bit general, but it comes from a very personal place. I'm an Israeli citizen, and I'm also now finishing my PhD here at Kiel University. And my question might be three small questions. Like, what is the role of first academics, people in academia, whether historians, jurists, lawyers, any person in academia, in basically making these connections and educating or learning about the early forms of Zionism and the progress of the Zionist movement alongside the Nazi movement and these possible cooperations in present-day contemporary academic work, articles published in academic journals. How can we empower this book and this debate in our academic writings? And the second question is similar, but about boycott, divestment, and sanction, which we talked a little bit about earlier, but how can we as BDS activists use this sort of discourse that will be presented, that we talked about today, and that will obviously appear in the book, in our campaign, in order to make it stronger, in order to have more people join the campaign and so on. And the third question is, again, that's maybe the most personal one. What is our role as a small group of Israeli dissenting voices, people who are Israeli citizens, or like me, I don't have any other citizenship? What is our role in educating and bringing this to this sort of discourse to the outside world, and how can we empower this debate? So thank you.
Well, Tony, you have 6 questions asked by 4 people. I hope you can deal with this.
Yes. Again, I'll start with the last first, if you like. Peretz asks, what is the role of academics? It's a good question. I think, to be honest and to tell the truth and to have some integrity, because so many academics shy away from difficult questions. I mean, there are thousands of books on the Holocaust and the Second World War, but there's virtually none which deal with the role of the Zionists. I mean, there's a couple by Francis Nicosia, the Raoul Hilberg Professor of Holocaust Studies at Vermont. There are bits and pieces in other books. Of course, there are journal articles, but by and large, academia has completely avoided the question. And when Ken Livingstone spoke about Havara, he was attacked by academics in the newspapers, completely subservient,
forelock-tugging academics. He didn't dare to challenge an establishment narrative. And of course, the establishment narrative is that Zionism was a natural successor to the fight of the Jewish resistance, because they've co-opted the very Warsaw Ghetto fight that they opposed initially. So, I mean, that is what I would say the role of academics is. It's the stand against the stream, if you like. How can we use this stuff in terms of BDS? I think we have to be unafraid to actually say out aloud that when the Holocaust was at its height, the Zionist movement was nowhere to be seen. I mean, the Zionists had possession of information about the extermination because people thought that there were just a series of pogroms rather than an extermination plan by the Nazis in 1942, because it really, the Holocaust got going in earnest in 1942, although it began with the invasion of Russia in 1941, arguably with the murder of the disabled in Germany in 1939. But quite simply, I mean, we have to call out Israel for what, and the Zionist movement for what it is. I mean, the Zionists, Rabbi Stephen Weiss, openly boasted that he kept news of the Holocaust hidden secret for 3 months, from September to November 1942, when eventually the Jewish Agency announced that the Holocaust was taking place, though it then went on to deny it in January. It was quite amazing, really. But to just point these things out in itself, but I think in Germany, where the propaganda is most vile and widespread, then one has to be clear that if the German state is attempting to ban anti-Zionists, then really it is no different from its Nazi predecessor, who did exactly the same to anti-Zionist Jews and Jewish organizations in Germany. And I think that point needs to be made clear. And I intend to do a blog specifically on that when I get a bit of time. Verena, yes, I mean, Havara, I mean, the Nazi state was actually very weak in 1933. It was beset by problems. The boycott had had a remarkable effect on its foreign trade. And that's why it actually called in the Jewish leaders I think it was March 25th, to try and get them to call off a massive demonstration in New York, something Goring called them in. And the Zionists came to that meeting, although they weren't initially invited, and they promised to do something. I mean, they were eager to help, whereas the other Jewish leaders made excuses about this. The Nazis were extremely worried about the boycott, and with good reason, because it was drying up their international trade. They lost the whole of the South American market. Bosch had, for example, in Egypt, of all places, there was almost a total boycott. In Poland, it was the boycott again was almost unanimous. I mean, there was antagonisms anyway between Poland and Nazi Germany, and so there was quite fulsome support for it. But the Zionists really, in many ways, rode to the rescue. I mean, Edwin Black, whose book The Transfer Agreement is a must to read, posits the fact that but for Havara, the Nazi regime might not have survived. And that's not wishful thinking. That's exactly what David Cesarani, who was a Zionist historian, he says in his book Final Solution that it's true that the Nazi state was extremely weak. And I quote in my book the Investors' Review, a British paper of the 5th of August 1933, which reported that authoritative opinion is that Hitlerism will come to a sanguinary end before the new year. And I say Cesarani suggested that those who doubted the viability of the regime were not engaged in wishful thinking, unquote, quote unquote, and that it was beset by enemies coupled with a chronic balance of payments deficit. So Havara, far from having saved anyone, probably guaranteed the stability of the Nazi regime, and that was the achievement of the Zionists. And that's, I think, which we should also make very clear. And that's, I think, how we deal with boycott and Havarah, because of course Havarah, the Nazis agreed to this trading agreement. It wasn't particularly profitable for them because there was no hard currency gain, precisely because they saw it would undermine and destroy the boycott campaign. And the Zionists played into that. And that's why, I mean, the Zionists were accused of being scab agents for the German state. Noel asks about the Holocaust memorials and so on. The only thing I would say is, yes, you're getting a sprouting of all these Holocaust memorials and so on. And the reason why is very little to do with the Holocaust, because you don't see the same regarding the slave trade. You don't see any mention of the Gypsies. I mean, on the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, the genocide of the Gypsies is called the genocide, but it isn't. But the Holocaust is reserved for Jews alone. And the Zionists have always sought to make the Holocaust unique to the Jews. And the reason was because of its propaganda and political value. As Gerhard Riegner, the Jewish agency rep in Geneva during the war, said, we have to preserve our political capital. And to them, the Holocaust is political capital. And that's why the British state is happy to go along with funding these memorials, and the American state too. It's not out of any anti-racist commitment, because it reinforces the imperialist narrative. There was another question, but it was in the chat, so maybe I'll take that one up as well. Could Zionism have gone in a different direction if people like Judah Magnus and Martin Buber had triumphed? They were the cultural Zionists. Judah Magnus was the first principal of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and he helped found Brit Shalom, a peace movement, but it was only about 200 strong of intellectuals in Palestine at the time. And my answer is no, because they would not have triumphed. They were what were called the cultural Zionists. I mean, they were tolerated, but no more than that. I mean, the Labour Zionists had utter contempt for them, but they had no means to mobilise anyone, and they were without any base whatsoever. And Magnus himself was basically forced to flee Palestine in 1948 because he didn't support the establishment of a Jewish state. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Just on the last point, you would have noted, if you are reading on this topic at all, that Israel was and still is against other mass murders being called genocide. For example, Israel fought very successfully against the Armenians, claiming that the killing of 1.5 million Armenians by the Turks under the Ottoman Empire was a Holocaust and a genocide. And they succeeded. People don't call it a Holocaust for sure. They don't call the Holocaust that happened in Biafra a Holocaust. They don't call, similar other Holocausts. Now, there are today many academics who are actually collecting the different genocide around the world. And of course, the largest one was the genocide against the slaves during slavery that Britain has started. So this is one point. The other point is very interesting. Somebody asked, how do we connect the struggle for freedom in Palestine and the end of Zionism with this topic that Tony has so carefully researched and written about? Well, Israel is acting against BDS like it acted against the BDS against the Nazis. This is really interesting. Most Palestinians don't understand the amazing, first of all, they don't know the details, and Tony is totally right. Please read the book by a Zionist, Edwin Black, that actually exposes the Zionist Federation for all its crimes during the 30s, around Havarah, but this has lasted much longer than just Havarah. So the way that this was understood around the world is if the Zionist Federation comes to an agreement with the Nazis, how can we, who are not Jewish, for example, act against the Nazis if the Zionist Federation is acting against them, and that the only foreign flag which is allowed to fly in Berlin is the flag of the Zionist Federation. It is an incredible fact that the only foreign embassy, if you want, that was allowed in Berlin was that of the Zionist Federation. So I think we are probably tired you enough, Tony.
No. I was going to reply to you on Armenia, because the book contains quite a bit about the Zionist attitude to Armenia, and it starts right at the very beginning with Herzl, because Herzl, as I said, was a correspondent for the New Free Press, and he negotiated. He actually met the Ottoman Sultan, and he promised, and he carried out. He did his best as a correspondent to whitewash the massacres and the treatment of the Armenians, so much so that Bernard Lazar, who was a member of the Zionist Actions Committee, which was the power between the Zionist Congresses, who'd been one of the founders, in fact, he was the initiator of the campaign to free Dreyfus. He resigned from the Zionist Actions Committee and issued a bitter open letter about Herzl's making a pact with every reactionary going. And that's continued to this day. The Zionists have supported in the American Congress and, of course, the Knesset, the idea of recognizing the Armenian genocide as a genocide, let alone the Holocaust. And in 1982, there was a genocide conference held in, I think it was Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, and an Israeli scholar who organized it, Israel Charney, found a massive campaign against it to basically disinvite speakers. And it was led by Eli Wiesel, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Arthur Hertzberg, and various others. But you can read about that in my book as well. When it comes to other people, then it's not unique. But the Holocaust is unique to the Jews, even though the Gypsies, of course, suffered the same losses proportionally as the Jews. So, I mean, and no one talks about a gypsy state after all.
And Stanley Hiller just shared with you on the chat something that I was going to say, that the book, when it came out in '84, I think, was so disturbing for the Zionists in the United States that he was contacted by Abe Foxman, who is a well-known Zionist apparatchik, and he was forced to include 4 pages by Abe Foxman, who are actually turned every argument in the book on its head and basically said that the book is anti-Zionist, yeah? So without using that term. Now, I think, Tony, you've done a marvelous job for 2 hours, and I think we've probably got to call it a day. Thank you very, very much. I hope that Tony has managed to persuade you, and I would like to help him in doing that, that this book is crucial for anyone wishing to understand the inner contradictions of Zionism and the lies about anti-Semitism. Zionism is not fighting anti-Semitism. It's fighting people like Tony, me, and many others who are actually supporting Palestine and its rights. They have no interest in real anti-Semitism, only in the fake anti-Semitism. So thank you all very much. 135 that stuck out for 2 hours. We started with many more. It's the largest webinar that we've held, quite justifiably. Thank you all, and see you in the next webinar. Thank you, Tony.
Okay, thank you. And